Okay, for the first several quick practices, in fact, for lessons 3 to 11, we're going to practice the routine that they actually introduced in lesson 2. So in lesson 2, we go through a partner routine and it's a part of the activity. So you'll introduce this in that activity and then it becomes a regular quick practice every day. So the slides prior to these tell kind of the general flow of what's supposed to happen, student leader 1, student leader 2, etc. I would think that 2 student leaders would probably be enough because having 4 students up there might be too many and then kids start goofing around. But you choose how you want to do that. Just know that in the book it starts with 4 student leaders. Okay, so I'm going to do it based on 2 and then you can change it as you would like. So I'm going to actually move all of these pages back. And a student leader number 1 would say, which column in the multiplication chart is 6 and 16? And they're going to ask that question. So kids are going to start to think, they're looking at the multiplication chart. And then the student leader would immediately say, which factor has 6 and 16 as multiples? Think about it. Class. And what students should say is they should say 2. 2 has multiples of 6 and 16. Student leader 2 then would come over and they would grab the little blue strip and they would put it on the 2 columns, right? So I was writing up here, but student leaders, if you're using the Google slide deck, could also just drag and drop the card. So we know that 6 and 16 are multiples of 2. And I can show it 6 and 16. Then this student leader would say, boys and girls, which row on the multiplication chart has 6 and 27? Which factor has 6 and 27 as multiples? Think about it. So kids that are struggling are looking at the multiplication chart. We're trying to make a connection there. And they would say class, and the whole class would say 3. The student leader, the second student leader, would drag and drop that red transparency strip, or if you're using your class multiplication chart, they would affix the red transparency strip that comes with your kits. So the student leader then would mark 3 right here. Now the student leader can go in any direction they want. So technically the student leader could have started with 6 and 27. They could have started with 6 and 16. But now they're going to go based on what they know. So if the top of this column is 2, the bottom is what? 2. If the left of this row is 3, then the right is what? 3. So now you can ask those questions, or leaders can just go ahead and label both of them as they go. So when we decided it was 2 as the factor, they'd put 2 here, they'd put 2 here. When 3 was the factor, they put it on both sides. And now the student leader would say, boys and girls, 3 times what number gives me 27? Think about it. Class, and they would say 9. This student leader would come over and drag it to the 9s column. Now I'm going to put the 9 at the bottom, and the student leader would say, boys and girls, 2 times what gives me 16? Think about it. Class, and the class would say 8. The student leader would drag and drop this to 8. Boys and girls, 8 times 9 equals how many? Think about it. Class, and they would say 72. Now, if students are not proficient in their facts, that's why they also have the multiplication chart. Boys and girls, let's check our factor puzzle. 6 and 16, 6 and 16, 27, 72, 27, 72. Then you'd go to your next problem. Boys and girls, what column in the multiplication chart can I find 32 and 56? Class, which factor has both 32 and 56 as multiples? Okay, so you can see that I'm going to go through the exact same routine, right? I asked both questions. Which column on the multiplication chart? Which factor has these numbers as their multiples? Which row on the multiplication chart? Which factor has these numbers as multiples? Okay, as soon as we find that, we're going to label it, and then the second student leader is going to come over and mark it on the multiplication chart. You're going to continue that for 11 lessons. So every lesson technically has 2 different slides. So you can see in the notes it says lesson 1.8, and you can see that there's 2 lesson 1.8, 1.8, 1.8, 1.9, 1.9. Okay, so there's 2 different slides per lesson. Once I get to lesson 12, now I'm working on telling proportion problems. So again, there are several student leaders here in which, one student leader would come up and do a part of the problem. Then the second student leader could come up and do part of the problem. I'm going to leave that up to you if you have that many students involved. I prefer to have as many students respond as possible. So you can do it with one student leader or 6. But essentially the student leader is going to give a proportion problem based on the context. So because we want all students to participate, this would be an example of students getting to even turn and talk, tell their neighbor a proportion problem, and maybe the student leader quickly calls on someone. But if we're going to do that turn and talk, we have to make it very quick, like 30 seconds, because we don't want to waste time. We only get 5 minutes for these quick practices. So the student leader would read context. Erica is mixing cans of blue paint and white paint to get pale blue paint. Give a proportion problem for each factor puzzle and then solve it. Okay, so the first, everyone turn and talk and tell your neighbor a proportion problem for this factor puzzle. Everyone would turn and talk, boys and girls, who has a problem? And the student leader might, or a student might call on, the student leader might call on a student, and the student might say, Erica mixed 6 cans of white paint and 10 cans of blue paint to get a pale blue paint. How many cans of white paint does she need to get 30 cans of blue paint to get the same blue paint? Now we're going to switch rows. So the student leader would come up and they would highlight that this is the row we have now, and now we want that same row, but we're going to switch it. So I now need 6 and 10, and then I need 30. So because I switched those rows, now the student leader would say, turn and tell your neighbor a new proportion problem for factor puzzle number 2. Okay, so they're going to turn and talk. She's going to call on someone, and someone else is going to say, how many cans of white paint would we need to mix with 30 cans of blue paint to make the same color blue as we would have with 6 cans of white paint and 10 cans of blue paint? So you can see that the student leader now can circle. You can see that the rows have changed. Next, we're going to flip the columns based on factor puzzle number 1. So here's factor puzzle number 1. I'm now going to flip that and put the factor or the columns in reverse order. So we're going to switch those columns. So now I know I'm going to have 10, and I'm going to have 30, and then I'm going to have 6. So the student leader is going to walk through that, and then the student leader would say, boys and girls, turn and tell your neighbor a proportion problem. Okay, so they're going to turn and tell, and they would say, call on someone, and they would say, for 10 cans of white paint, Erica used 6 cans of blue paint to make a pale blue paint. If she uses 30 cans of white paint, how many cans of blue paint is she going to need? Okay, so once we've gone through the stories, and that's all we're rehearsing. We're rehearsing how the story changes based on what is unknown. Okay, so once we do that, then we can ask students to solve them. Maybe they solve them on their whiteboards. Maybe they solve them just using their multiplication chart. Maybe the student leader walks them through, right? So maybe we continue to say, so what is the common factor with multiples of 10 and 30, right? And the student leader might say 2, right? So I might say 2. I could even say 10 here. And then the student leader is going to say, boys and girls, what's a factor that has a common multiple of 6 and 10? And the student leaders the students would say 2. Boys and girls, if I know 2 times what equals 6, and they would say 3. And then I would say, well, if I know that this is 3, then I know that this is 3, right? And now I can start to solve. So they could go through and solve the entire factor puzzle to actually solve that proportion. Or do all 3, but we want them to notice the similarities and differences when there are 3 different factor puzzles with all of the same numbers. So most importantly, they're going to tell those proportion problems, and then they can go through and solve if time allows, and if you feel like that's something they need rehearsal of skills in. Otherwise, they would go to the second one, and now they're going to give the context, and then they're going to give a proportion problem for each factor puzzle, and then if time allows, they're going to solve it. Thank you.